Good, good to go. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, for the record, Jake Claro, I'm the Farm to Plate Director at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, and a resident of Berry City. So yeah, today is part one of two parts, to give all of you a really comprehensive overview of the food system in Vermont. And so today is I'm going to just put it out in front. It's very data oriented. So it's going to be, I think, pretty dense. But yeah, this will hopefully serve as a really strong foundation and reference point for conversations that you're going to continue to have. And uh, yeah, and
There's a lot of data. Sorry, the
Yeah.
reflection is really hard for me to see. If we could close the shade. I'll miss a lot if I'm supposed to be looking at details. I won't get them with the window open right now.
Yeah, and I have shared the PDF version of this because I think yeah, there's gonna be stuff that we'll want to return to and look back. Yeah. And yeah, we are scheduled to be here for part two on Friday, so we might adjust.
Oh, that's much better.
If we're not getting through everything today, there will be some time to continue. All right. So just we last time we were here last week, kind of shared our perspective on what we mean by food system, but I just want to reiterate that we're really trying to look at this comprehensively, from farm inputs all the way to back to nutrient management. So we're not just talking about farm production. We're going to cover today a lot about production, but also processing, distribution, kind of market sales. We're also going to cover some environmental data and some food access stuff that I think this committee has heard a lot about maybe in previous weeks, and just to reiterate some of that, like what you've already seen there. And also just a reminder that this is in a lot of ways a bit of a progress report on how we're doing towards the 15 strategic goals of the state's food system strategic plan. So just a reminder that sort of what we're selecting to show you relates to these goals. In a lot of ways, these act as indicators of how we're doing. And these are kind of the basic sections that this presentation will be organized around. So buckle up. It's going to be a lot. There's a lot of slides. There's a lot to get through, and try to have some breaks for questions and conversations. And so here we go. All right, so the first section we're going to cover is really focused around the economic development goals. So we're going to be looking at economic output, demand for local food. We're going to be trying to explore and indicate, how diverse is the production portfolio in Vermont? What kind of processing infrastructure exists? The types of jobs. And a question came up last week around economic output of the food system. So here's the latest economic census 2022. I would treat this a little bit as preliminary because we haven't been able to dig too much in depth on this or adjust for inflation. But this gives you a sense of the breakdown of $11.5 billion of economic output that's happening across the food system in Vermont. And you can look at that as, production and processing alone is $4.3 billion of economic output. And, breaking that down, agricultural farm gate sales is now $1 billion industry. Food manufacturing is another $3 billion. And then you have, distribution. So wholesaling activities are $3.6 billion. And then you've got the retail and kind of food service, the actual market side is putting out another like $3.5 billion of output. The one anomaly from 2022 from the previous economic output data is that the retail side, not sure why this is exactly, but is down from previous years. That could be maybe there's some COVID impacts that are reflected in this data set, but there is variation. So yeah, just not quite sure what the cause of that is. And also we would have liked to, you'll see some of the food manufacturing specifics a little more as I go through. but some of that data is suppressed. So unfortunately, right now, meat processing is a figure that we would like to let you know sort of where that stands, but that information right now is not available to us, but there may be ways that it will be available in time. So yeah, so $11.5 million of economic output. So from a very macro scale, we'll get into how this breaks out by different categories of employment. But if you're looking across, farm inputs, farm operators, hired labor, manufacturing, distribution, retail, and then there's some smaller categories. Those last three: community, food service, regulatory, and fishing, which are a little sliced at the end. So those are the categories of jobs that we're looking at and considering as part of the food system in Vermont. So if you look over time, from 2009 to currently, a 9.4% increase in employment. More than 63,000 people in Vermont are in some ways employed, involved in the food system. So there was a 10% decrease from 2019 to 2020 due to COVID-19. So that's what that kind of drop off in ledges in between those years. But since that point in time, 4,900 net new jobs have been added. And so we're getting close again to the peak employment levels pre-COVID. And just in the last 3 years, an 8.4% increase in employment. And I'll show you kind of what that decline, what's responsible mainly for that decline. So that's just very high level. And if we look at the percent breakdowns, so yes, retail, employment is in the food system is a considerable part of where people are employed, but farm operators and hired farm labor are 33% of the food system labor force. So, a lot of people still involved in agricultural activities. 12% are involved in food manufacturing, 4% in distribution. And then again, there's some smaller categories there. So, a lot of people still involved in production, agriculture, and manufacturing in the state. So, yeah, here's a look at those figures at the categories over time, and just a couple of things to point out here. The main reason for the decline in employment from 2019 to 2020 was mainly due to retail employment losses. So those account for 92% of the total COVID employment losses in the food system. Elsewhere, across the board, a lot of stability in employment. So the thing that I've taken away from this is that employment in the food system is pretty resilient. And then also a couple other things here is that food manufacturing employment 22.8% increase since 2012. So that's a really robust and thriving part of our food system economy, and continues to add employment over time. If you're really looking at this closely, you'll see there's a farm input decrease. That is actually not related to COVID. This is a change in methodology for how we're calculating employment in that industry. So previously, animal vets is a category that's contained in that, and we had just included the full number of vets, but that's not reflective of actually like large animal vets and vets that are involved in agriculture. So we used some survey data that is old now. It is dated, but it estimated that about 6% of vets are involved in some ways in agriculture. So we've adjusted that figure, and because of that, there's now a decrease in the number of jobs that we count in that category. So really, robust employment, resilient employment, and even retail now, is finding recovery since COVID.
Representative O'Brien.
Just quickly, Jake, it would help to have some context with like the rest of Vermont too here. So do you have those further down?
Yeah, I wish I had included the figure here, and I'm trying to recall the percentage of like employment in the food system, how much that accounts for employment in the state as a whole.
I was wondering the same.
It's quite, yeah, I think it might be more than that.
Over 10% of our population as a whole.
Right,
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's a considerable amount, and even, I think even on the farm labor side, that's about 3% of total employment, so, it's a significant amount, of overall employment in the state. Yeah. So in terms of establishments, so we track both jobs and establishments as part of if you recall the enabling legislation, right, we're trying to stimulate jobs and establishments, an increase in jobs and establishments in the food system. And so we also track this over time. Not as much variation here, but a 4.3% increase since 2009. And I'm gonna kind of show how that breaks out by these different categories. So farms, on this side of the equation, farms are the significant percentage of actual like individual establishments. However, we have seen a 10.9, almost 11% decrease in farms since 2012. That's a net change, but if you look at the change in number of dairy farms, dairy accounts for about half of that decrease. And then in other places, 19% increase in food manufacturers, almost 24% increase in distributors, and then strangely, while retail employment has declined, retail establishments has actually increased since 2012 by almost 17%. And I think that's reflective of a more diverse retail kind of sector in the state. A lot of different stores and restaurants and places where people are purchasing food. So certainly, I think that is reflective of an increase, like diversity of options and different types of stores that have opened in the state on the retail side.
That's just food retailers, some sort of food.
Yeah. All right, just picture break. So just trying to break up some of the data slides here. All right, and also this is transitioning more now to the farm gate side. So deeper dive here into production and market value by different types of industries in the state. So again, high level, $550 million increase in farm gate sales since 1997. This is not inflation adjusted. So certainly, there's inflationary effects here, but I think it's again indicative of an industry that continues to evolve and find ways to increase value. Yeah.
Can you define the farm gate? I just don't know that expression.
Yeah, so that's sort of raw product sales at a farm. That could be a direct consumer sale, that could be a sale to a manufacturer, or a wholesaler.
So sales on any level
so-
that come from a farm.
Yeah, just at the farm level. So it's not looking at any added value beyond the farm. Yeah. And we'll get into that with some of the processing slides. And then looking just at this by county, what are the main where are these sales concentrated across the state? So Addison, Franklin, Orleans, Orange, and Chittenden are the top 5. And so this is kind of change over time from 2012 to 2022. So these are the ag census intervals. And another thing is just looking at this across every county has seen a sales increase over that time period. And even though Addison and Franklin certainly are really significant drivers here, again, sales are pretty spread out across the state, and these are in thousands of dollars. So each of these can be read as being in millions. So from the lowest, 15 million, 200,000 of sales happening in Essex up to 262 million in Addison.
And does this include bulk fluid milk sales, or is this only like milk sales that are incurring it within the state?
So this would be, again, like farm, like whatever is being recorded as a farm gate milk sale is what this is accounting for. So it wouldn't be, there's no processing or additional kind of value added activities added to
That's
that.
like the milk checks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Just an observation, I never really thought about this, but there's a really interesting north-south divide in agriculture in Vermont. When you look at those four southern counties, they don't add up to a lot compared to.
When you add in the dairy, bulk,
yeah,
commercial farm sales from dairy, and then you think about the land that's available for that scope of interest, it'd be interesting to see it with the milk sales backed out. Then you'd get a more of an accurate look at what Vermont is doing for Vermont. I mean, no doubt that what we do benefits Vermont, but what Heather does, and it's grown in Vermont, sold in Vermont, stays in Vermont. And some of what Greg does, and perhaps what you do and other people do. So you would probably see those county levels change. Chittenden County is not a great dairy county, but holy cow, the Intervale and all the food to plate opportunities there.
Yeah.
And you take the milk sales out of Essex County, well, it's April's maple.
but yeah.
We got first season.
Yeah.
I do, I think you'll see this trend throughout, because it'll show up in other places. It is reflective of the scale of the dairy industry and how it gets distributed across the state. So I think that it'll show up in other places, but yeah, that is a big factor. So here we go. So looking at this by the commodity groups, dairy by itself is already about 60% of the total, farm gate sales. And if you look at, these trends over time, and from 2017 to 2022, milk sales have increased. Maple sales saw a huge jump of $54 million over that 5-year period. Vegetable sales, 70% increase, and poultry and eggs almost nearly doubled over that time period. But the scale of sales of those industries is much smaller in comparison to milk. And this is the first 2022 is the first census year where we had, with maple syrup, another industry that was over $100 million in farm gate sales. And then other crops and hay, so feed, and that's also associated with both milk and beef and kind of livestock production, is a considerable amount as well.
What's the time period there, Jim?
So this is 2022, but those increased values are in comparison to 2017.
5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, jump in, so for the record, I'm gonna every once in a while
That's right.
jump in with a so what type comments as we look at this, think about this data. So in this particular slide case, this makes really great aligned sense with the investment of the ag development grants in meat, maple, and produce. And that was sort of what we were talking about this morning, about when you see sales increase and revenue growth, you need to also accompany that with infrastructure investment. And so that's really an example of huge growth in these sectors and a real opportunity to make sure that we're, supporting those businesses to be able to continue to have these kinds of revenue growth. There's a lot of dairy stories to tell. I think last data that we have 444 dairy farms in Vermont. We lost over 20 farms in November. So there's some real, hard conversations and kind of emotion around sort of what's shifting in the dairy economy. And like how much growth is still needed for these diversified operations to sort of like, kick in at the scale of impact and influence that the dairy economy does here in Vermont. I did want to also just add that when we're talking about farms, 94% of the, ag census farms say that they're family farms. So I know there's been just a lot of thought about like, who are the farmers? And they are all of different sizes and ages and, stages of development, but, growth majority are family farm operations in Vermont.
Just another, for the record, Ellen Taylor, from Vermont Sale and House Farm. The other thing I'd like to point out about this slide is that look at the diverse products that we actually can produce in Vermont. So you think about so many states, like they're so heavily commodified in like only wheat and corn and soybeans, for instance. They're not really producing for human consumption as much, right? Or in this level of diversification, it has to get processed into something else in order to be able to eat it. And, I think the opportunity here as we continue to support the dairy industry, regardless of what happens with it, there is major opportunity in these other types of products because we eat a well-rounded plate of food, right? We're not just eating maple syrup on pancakes every single morning. So I guess some people do. And only consuming dairy products. We have a diverse palate, right? And so the exciting opportunity is that we can actually produce more of what we eat here in the state. And this shows that like we already do, we just need to continue to invest in those additional operations.
Just a quick question. Are mushrooms included in vegetables?
Yes.
Produce, yes, yeah, and so in this one,
So it'd be under
it would
the
be in
40.
vegetables, yeah.
Okay.
We know better in this committee.
I know there's some potential, yes, some pitfalls, yeah.
Fungi should be their own category.
So there's a phenomenon that the longer you leave a slide up, the more time there's.
Yes.
And I have one other question.
Yeah.
Illustration. Yeah, just it's observing that 87% growth in poultry and eggs is pretty dramatic over 5 years. Do we account for that? And the vegetable growth too, sales of vegetables up 70%. Do we attribute that to shifting farm types as dairy farmers sold?
I possibly, but I think it accounts for the maturing of those farm types. So if you think about, a lot of new beginning farmers either coming to the state or getting involved in agriculture around 2010 and before, those farms have grown over time. And I think especially in the vegetable industry, that's reflective of, I think, the maturity of individual farms. And the same, poultry and eggs, I think, where there was a boom in like very diversified farms, I think some of those farms have now chosen to be more specialized. And so in turn, they found success, say, in poultry and eggs, and have put more concentrated effort into that. So, and the classification of this is if the farm is making more than 50% of its sales through that commodity. So again, it's not to say that, diversified farms have just chosen to get into just poultry and eggs, but that those categories are producing more than 50% of their sales. That's what I would attribute to.
I mean, the only thing I'm thinking about for poultry and egg sales, and this isn't verified, but like eggs used to be like $2.50 a dozen, not that many years ago, and now, I mean, that the price of grain and other, inputs have really, exploded for good and bad reasons, and therefore I think, egg sales have really shifted. If, you can buy whoever's eggs at the grocery store for $6 a dozen or purchase them from a local farm stand, I think the choice for many consumers is relatively easy.
Yes, so just one last thing I'll say is that I think that 100 million mark is so Mark Cannella at UVM Extension has done a lot of farm viability work actually and benchmarking in maple syrup, has talked about that 100 million kind of mark as being a target for industry like maturity and scale, and at Abby's point, like that's where you start to see infrastructure and yeah, just like market access start to be just much larger.
What was the excluding on the hay?
So-
It says other crops and hay excluding dot dot dot.
Oh, excluding, I can't remember.
If you give us long enough, we.
Yeah.
Keep going, keep
Yeah.
going.
So here's looking at so for lack of a better way to describe this, non-dairy livestock. So this is beef, poultry and eggs, sheep and goat, sort of other animals, animal products is basically diversified livestock, and then pigs. I should note, however, that beef sales are still very heavily driven actually by dairy farms. So if you look at dairies or beef sales contributions to that total, it is pretty significant. And we're seeing more shifts, by dairy farms into beef sales and beef production. But looking at this, so we've seen livestock growth from 2007 to 2022. So these industries are maturing, and again, poultry and egg sales have nearly doubled since 2007, and even from 2017. So some real growth there. Interestingly, pork, pigs is not a significant sales area, but it has seen growth over time. And then looking at the produce side, a lot of the produce and then also nursery floriculture industry sales growth has been driven by growth in vegetable sales. So it is more than tripled since 2007, increasing by $27 million. But I think the other thing here to take note of is the nursery floriculture industry is not insignificant. So 25 million in sales there. And then fruit and tree nuts have been relatively stable over time, and berries has seen some modest growth. Berries was not a separate category in 2007, so that's just why it was included with vegetables. So that's why it's not broken out there. Yeah.
And maybe on the produce side, because we were talking this morning about farm size as sort of like a differentiating factor. The Agency of Agriculture doesn't have an inventory of all produce operations because we don't regulate the produce industry in that same way that we might other sectors and commodities. But we do, through our produce program, do ask for voluntary reporting through our produce portal related to the Food Safety Modernization Act and the Produce Safety Rule. So we have 723 produce operations that do share their information with us, including their annual sales. And of those 723, over 500 make less than $25,000 in annual produce sales. And 22 make more than $500,000. And so every time we talk with kind of our colleagues at UVM Extension or within the fruit and veggie berry growers community, they just sort of acknowledge that those 22 farms that are grossing or netting more than grossing more than $500,000 a year are really kind of like holding the produce industry, wholesale industry on their shoulders. And that much of the produce industry is sort of like still in that growth phase. And there's very few that are really, greater than $500,000 in business.
And those 22, very similar to the largest dairies, have succession issues facing them. They're older operators that, if we were to lose those operations, would be significant.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Looking at that last slide and this discussion about the income and the number of farms and the size of the farms, like on pork, how accurate do you think our piglet sales numbers are? Because a lot of people do their own pork. And I mean, I'm sure, if they're not expensing their grain and whatnot, and they're growing a pig or two in their backyard, and then they're getting it slaughtered and goes in their own freezer. I mean, it is Vermonters feeding Vermonters.
Right.
It's just self-feeding. I mean, we don't take that into account. We don't take into the family that has a large garden and growing all their potatoes and root crops and whatnot, things that'll store.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these are, these are estimates, and they often may not be accounting for, kind of community scale, transactions or
Left pocket money.
Yeah,
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 that's what I call
yeah,
it.
yeah. Right.
Well, the USDA definition of a farm is $1,000 or more. So if that two pig backyard operation is just feeding themselves, it wouldn't be counted in the
No.
census because it
No.
wouldn't be considered a
No.
farm by USDA standards.
Well, it's,
Some like the Pharaohs do sows and.
yeah, that definition though is not, it doesn't have to be reported sales. It could just be the potential to generate $1,000 of sales. So there could be some very small kind of homestead operations that do get accounted for here.
Representative Lipsky?
This is a question really for you, Abby. With all these slides, the amount of vegetables has been surprisingly low to me. So who are examples of the large vegetable producers?
So
That we might recognize.
Yeah, so the census says there's 1,130 produce farms in Vermont. We have contact information and sales data from 723 of them. Some of those, like we could almost look at the list from this morning of, Dutton Berry Farm, Jericho Settlers Farming. There are some names throughout Vermont that are sort of established as bigger produce operations.
Greens, Harlow's, Mazda.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
are considered bigger. Thank you, I'm just
Yeah.
trying to wrap my head.
Yeah,
Carlos in Westminster.
Carlos, yes, would definitely be,
And
yeah.
we'll see this in a later slide, but I think also considering the number of acres that are generating $40 million is pretty low. So there's a lot of value, per acre that a vegetable operation is producing. Yeah.
Representative O'Brien?
Jake, on that, what's the figure? It's like 10-12% of Vermont food that Vermonters are eating.
Yeah.
Does that include this sort of, let's say, sub-farm level of the home gardeners and the people raising their own pigs? It'd be interesting to know, like, how big that is.
It doesn't, but there is some research that UVM is involved with that's trying to put some value to that. And I have seen an estimate on like calories of production that comes from that kind of growing, and it's not insignificant. It does represent for some people a significant portion of their kind of caloric intake. And I think there's some work happening to try to then put like what's the dollar equivalent of that. Okay, another little picture break, and we're gonna talk about some processing. These next slides. Processing focus on dairy. We have in the state, there has been growth in dairy processors, and kind of a diversification happening between on and off farm processing. And so I think this is indicative of the industry really moving very hard towards value added production, and a lot of individual farms getting involved in their own processing activities. Certainly cheese production is a big part of this, and so dairy processing, it's a $1.8 billion industry. And then cheese is a subset of that, and cheese alone is almost a $1.2 billion industry. So that's pretty substantial. And I think to Abby's, what Abby was saying earlier about as these industries grow and diversify, that infrastructure is a key component. And as much as I know we can talk about a lot of the struggles of dairy, there's a lot to look to in terms of how an industry develops and invests in infrastructure and creates, additional value. And dairy, it has a huge economic impact and footprint in the state of Vermont. And you can also see, that, a lot of that comes through, adding processing capacity, and seeing it added in different ways. So at the farm scale, but also at the, larger kind of commercial scale. So meat processing, a little less growth here. But we have seen additional facilities come on board. And then also there's a new type of inspection, this CIS category. So Abby, I was coming here, I was like, I'm not going to forget what the acronym is. And now I'm like,
So I think it's cooperative interstate shipment.
yeah. And so those are state inspected facilities that are allowed to do interstate sales, which is normally just allowed for a USDA inspected facility. So it's normally a state inspected facility. The sales of products from that would have to stay within the state, but through this cooperative agreement, because also the state of Vermont has high state inspection standards, those facilities can get this additional certification and are allowed then to do interstate commerce. And so we've seen more meat processing facilities in Vermont take advantage of that. And so that's why there's kind of that split that starts to happen between the state meat processing and the CIS category. And then, so the agency has done some work surveying inspected facilities. And I should note too on this, that this is not accounting for sort of exempt and custom facilities that are not going through the state inspection or federal inspection. And so there's additional, meat slaughter and processing capacity that exists at that level.
These include poultry.
Yes. Yeah. And so the agency has done some survey work with processors asking about interest in facility expansion. And in both 2023 and 2024, there has been in the majority an interest in doing that. Slight decline from 2023 to 2024, but they were also asked what's the largest barrier, and funding and labor. So and labor has shown up consistently. Hearing facilities say that they could double throughput their capacity, they could add an additional a whole shift of workers if they were available. So that is a major constraint on our meat processing facility capacity, but also funding. So a lot of facility upgrades, new processing equipment. A lot of this processing equipment is scaled for much larger facilities, and so it's just there's a mismatch of what's needed and what's available to purchase, and those are a lot of expensive pieces of equipment. Those are the two significant barriers, and again, this just speaks to the ag development program and kind of the sector focus on meat, maple, and produce. Meat sector growth is heavily tied to processing capacity, and so as these constraints exist, that puts a lot of pressure back on farms and their ability to sell products or grow themselves.
Are H2A workers allowed to work in slaughterhouses?
Are they?
Yeah, I think it's just the
Yeah,
H2A worker program is in seasonal.
Right, have to be seasonal.
So you'd have to,
Have a shift essentially? Could you do like 6 hours? Yeah.
No, they can't.
Because it's a processing.
They can work in the fields.
they can't work in
Right.
the
They
processing.
can't work in a meat processing thing for sure. Maybe they could work in Greg's apple sorting
Yeah.
barn and I think they could go and tap ash trees when he was looking for maples and stuff, but I don't think they can. I know they can't work in a slaughterhouse legally, and that's
Okay.
one of the issues that, anyways, I won't talk
Yeah.
about that. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, but that, yeah, that was my impression was it's
Yeah.
has to be
Seasonal.
Has to be ag.
ag, yeah, ag.
And
Because also any like ag labor exemptions end when there's processing activities involved, so.
beach greens to the place.
Yeah.
100%. The Jamaicans go to the
Right.
Champlain Valley and pick apples. 100%, you know, and it's a wonderful program that needs to be expanded upon greatly.
But they couldn't work on the floor at Cabot, for example. Right?
They have actually hired him for that.
Yeah.
I believe it's through H2A somehow.
Oh.
It might not have been H2A, but yeah, H2A's hospitality.
Right.
But
Yeah,
They did hire him.
program, so.
We should look into that.
I don't know what program, so.
Yeah, they stayed right up here at the dorm, don't they, some of them, a bunch of them.
I don't know. So, but there's definitely a big need for more help.
And so we did some analysis, with, ourselves and work with a consultant to look at, trying to estimate over the next 3 years, the infrastructure investment needs across 5 industries. And so this would be mainly focused on processing capacity, storage, and storage and distribution. And these are, I would say, even these figures are conservative. And like the dairy number, for instance, is very specific to certain types of like value added production. So even these numbers are probably quite low. And the storage and distribution in particular, we've been finding that those investment needs are probably in a year outpacing what is this 3-year estimate. And so we also kind of broke this down by trying to think about like an 80-20 split between private investment and potential grant funding needs that would be used as kind of seed funding to stimulate additional investment, to attract additional investment. Given the size and scale of our industries, it can be difficult initially to attract that private capital. And so that's where, our state and federal, funding comes into play. And so over the 3-year period, just for the processing, we're looking at potentially $165 million of need, and storage and distribution at 13.6 million. And then, if you look at, you can start to look at that at these individual industry levels. Livestock, almost 60 million, dairy, very kind of limited scope, 53, produce, 46. And then even looking at some new emergent types of production and value added activity, grain infrastructure, 15 million. And then permanent crops, this was looking more at like tree nuts and kind of berries. So we weren't looking at apple needs, but if you consider probably apple infrastructure, that number would increase even more. So just to pick out produce as an example, like wash pack facilities, which may be larger than individual farm level, are those could be $1 to $3.5 million facilities. They could create more opportunities for aggregation of small farm products, light processing, packaging, and then sales to both in-state and out-of-state markets. But we lack that. That infrastructure is lacking on the produce side, and so and then there's also a lot of and Abby could speak to this, of like individual level, farm level investment for produce that's been happening over time and will continue to be a need. So yeah, this is really indicative of infrastructure investment in order for these industries to grow is necessary and at a scale and magnitude that I think we haven't fully absorbed and really considered how to generate this level of investment.
When you think about the amount of money that every year gets allocated to Working Lands Enterprise Fund, it's a drop in the bucket from a need, and the Working Lands Enterprise Fund, of course, is also funding forestry operations. So the ag portion is even less. So for me, when this was calculated, even though these are still rough estimates, it's really helpful to get a sense of the order of magnitude right? Just to get a sense of scale that we're needing for investment. And again, as Jake said, you know, it might be that on the order of 80% of this would be private investment, right? If you think about going to get a Vita loan, you need an 80-20 loan to value ratio. Even 20% on 165 million, you know, that's a lot that we're not making happen yet.
And yeah, I can't remember, you know, the agency in the last couple of years through different grant programs has seen, you know, demand of $60 million and has only been able to allocate whatever, like 8.
Yeah, we talked about this the last couple of days, so the full economic development request within fiscal year 24 was 108 million, bless you. There was the demand just in the meat, maple and produce infrastructure was 44 million. Working lands in fiscal year 24's demand was over 16 million, which again is forestry and agriculture. But these estimates were part of what was utilized by the Future of Ag Commission to make that recommendation of $20 million for meat, maple and produce infrastructure based upon this kind of estimate of what the investment needs were. And then recognizing that that would only get us part of the way by having public investment.
And just, yeah, lastly, of in some ways how we got to these numbers too, was that we used the strategic plan and recommendations and gaps that were identified in that to then ask the question of what would it cost to implement that strategy or make the investments needed to accomplish the recommendation. So I didn't put a picture in here, but we're going to now shift to talking about farm viability. So it's all, you know, great to see gross sales growth and you know, in industries that are seeing growth, but there's also a fundamental question of, you know, are farms viable? You know, is this sustainable? Are the economic conditions supporting the well-being of our producers? And so this is looking at net sort of the percentage of farms reporting either net gains or net losses over time. And there was a time in 1997 where more farms were reporting that they had net gains than net losses. But since that point in time, the numbers have crossed over. And now, you know, we have more farms, 57% in the last census year that reported that they had net losses, and only 43% that reported they had net gains. The goal that's been identified in the strategic plan is to get back to that 50% break point. And so, yeah, this does raise, you know, significant questions about financial economic sustainability in our farming sector. And then you can start to really look at this broken out by different types of farm sizes. So this is average net income by size of farm. This is the 2022. So the average farm size in Vermont is 180 acres. There is only one category of acreage size that falls below that, where on average they're reporting net income, positive net income. So every acreage category under 140 acres, on average, that farm is going to likely be reporting net losses. And then what's not included here is farms that are greater than the 499 acreage category, because if you put them on this graph, these numbers start to get really hard to actually see. And so, you know, larger farms start to then see net gains from 152,000 up to 2.6 million. And that's in a very large acreage category. And then just another way to kind of look at these figures is then you can look at, you know, farms reporting different levels of sales. And so the break-even point here is that and it's very distinct and clear, is that farms, once they start to reach the $25,000 sales threshold, start to see in total, starting to see reported net gains of income. And so total net income in 2022 across all farms in Vermont was $310 million. But only 26% of farms account for that positive net income. And then 2.6% account for nearly 2/3. So that 1 million or more, is already accounting for $237 million of net income. So a lot of, I think there's just a lot of ways to look at this and ask questions about viability. But certainly, $25,000 and up is when you start to see, enough economic activity and perhaps economy of scale to see net income gains.
And maybe another way to think about it is, if you look at the census data of over 6,500 farms, a third of those farms are making less than $2,500 a year. So the definition, like the working definition of what's a viable farm, isn't the whole lot of 6,500 farms. It's somewhere when you're farming closer to 180 acres or when your sales are greater than 25,000. And that's just far smaller percentage and number of farms in Vermont.
What was that percentage that made 2,500?
Over 2,000 farms out of the 6,500 made less than $2,500 in 2022.
So maybe a third.
Yeah.
Richard?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Is that after they pay themselves or they, if they have labor, I'm sure the labor costs are out, but are people, there's all different ways to slice a pie. And so, if someone is making a living and they're happy and they have $2,500 to go buy more, they don't have a lot of money left to grow themselves. But if they're making a living and they're happy,
Right.
I mean, that's one thing. But if these are people trying to live making a farm and they only have $2,500, well, you gotta eat a lot of your own lettuce.
Yeah. I don't think the owner draw is factored into net. But all expenses, including labor, is and the point you're making is, I think what we also look at here is what is what's an amount that actually provides a living. But there's also, I think another thing to consider too is that some of these farms have off-farm income. So this is also reflective, I think, in some ways of rural economies and how people are making a living. But it is also concerning that can someone really live off of $3,700?
I think it's an important point and critical question and it sounds like, Jake, you're saying that these numbers are before you paid yourself, essentially, if you're
that
farmer.
That's my understanding. It may depend on how the reporting for labor in the census form, and I'm trying to think if there's an expense line that would account for owner draw or anything like that. And it might depend too on the business structure of the farm. But my understanding is that it's not taking that into account.
But I think it's fair to say that you're not gonna start having outside the family employees until you start getting into this range, right? So you're gonna be relying primarily on family members, and you may be producing stuff that you're eating, so you're not spending cash on them going to the store as much. So that's where it becomes a little bit hard to exactly tease it apart. But from a wraparound technical assistance and business assistance services perspective, it's strategically focusing on those farms in this range who really want to be in the business of farming and making sure that they have the tools that they need on the business side of things to be able to start moving up in terms of their income ability. Given that we have so few resources really available for that business assistance, being really strategic in its focus, how, who we're really targeting with that support, I think is important.
John had a question, and I realize we're halfway through the session, so we should ask you to find a good place to pause, and Jake, but John, go ahead.
Just along these same lines, so we know most Vermont farms are family owned. Are you tracking sort of gross of those farm families? Are you tracking like gross income, say? Because it seems like so many farms I know are only staying in business because somebody's working off the farm. You know, it's like the dairy farmers now working at United Ag just so they can keep their dairy going.
Yeah, and there is that is also reported in the census in terms of, and you can start to look at this by like farm type of off-farm income versus 50% of the income is coming from the actual farm operation. So we have access to that, and I think as you start to look at these numbers, you want to kind of start to dig deeper into like where is it more common. But we don't have anything right now that's like sort of put together and analyzed for that purpose.
Last little data point, so I said about a third of the farms less than the $2,500 in net sales, about 30% are also greater than 25,000. So about 2,000 farms are in that 25 or greater in annual net sales. So if that's a viability threshold moment, about 2,000 farms typically hit that.
So I have, there's just a couple more on viability. I think then that'd be a good stopping point. So this is one I think, depending on where you sit in the equation, you could see as potentially a good thing, potentially a bad thing. So value of farmland per acre, has been increasing over time, almost a 59% increase since 2010. Certainly if you own land, you could see this as a positive, but if you're seeking to purchase or lease, or access farmland, this presents challenges. And I think we talked about it last year, but as land prices increase, it puts different constraints on the next generation of farmers. It's just an additional expense, and also for a lot of new and beginning operations that may be changing over the type of production on land. They're also making a lot of other capital intensive investments. They're establishing new markets. So farmland costs, presents challenges to their long-term viability and in that critical stage of the first 5 years of their operation. So this is something that we try to watch, and again, though, there's ways in which this could be a wealth, source of wealth for farms that currently own land. So different ways to look at it. Demographics, so farm population, so the farm population is getting older. The average age right now is almost 58 years old. And almost 64% of farmers in Vermont are over the age of 55. And this map is showing the sort of percentage of farmers in each county who are 65 to 74. So Grand Isle, Lamoille, and Rutland, more than 30% of the farm population in those counties is in that age range. And so, a lot of real pressing succession challenges. Do these farms have identified successor? Do they have folks working with them that are younger? Because that graphics on the bottom right is just showing the age distribution, and a lot of farms are in that 45 plus range. So that presents some long-term challenges for succession of farmland over time. And then looking at just kind of the diversity, Vermont actually has on average a higher percentage of female operators. But we are still we're below national and the New England average for producers of color. And so, yeah, so there's, also considerations for how are we, attracting new farmers to the state, to the industry. Some opportunities there.
Jennifer?
Thanks, Sharon. Is that factoring in migrant labor?
So it's not, yeah, so that, yeah. So this is, just, so producers in this sense is either owners or those who have some level of like decision-making on the farm, and it's not accounting for migrant labor. And I found that the migrant labor statistics are hard, they're not tracked very well. And
It's just funny, it's a federal program.
yeah, and I've seen some estimates on probably, there's probably ways to find it.
But I mean, it's not, I
Yeah.
just wanted, maybe if it just said that for
Yeah.
future references, because I feel like there is a larger representation of BIPOC.
Yeah,
identified
absolutely. Yeah,
folks that work the land here.
yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
Okay.
The distinction is these are owners or managers rather than employees of any.
Yeah.
Their gender or.
I mean, a farm manager could count as a producer if it's the definition is like someone who has decision-making over day-to-day operations. And again, comes down to like, how is the census being filled out by someone who's making that decision of like, who has decision-making? It's not those people themselves who are reporting that. So it is up to the owner to kind of indicate that. Yeah.
Right, so we can pause here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why don't we, let's be back at 2:20 sharp. And see what else we can do for the rest of the hour.
Actually, we're on a good clip. So.
Did you make up these slides? Is it